turbo engine running.
Absolute genius.
Get this.
Welcome.
This is the show where we bring you
Science.
What that essentially means is
discoveries,
Advances.
Questions. Research.
technology. Unbelievable.
Without further ado,
This is The Naked Scientists. Hello, welcome to The Naked Scientists. This is the show where we bring you the biggest breakthroughs in science, technology and medicine with me, Chris Smith. And this week, we're asking whether nuclear innovation can help us to meet our energy needs and cut our carbon footprints.
From Cambridge University's Institute of Continuing Education, this is The Naked Scientists.
Electricity is expected to be in growing demand in the coming years. With the proliferation of new energy-hungry AI data centres and the electrification of transport cited as key drivers of the world's future economic landscape. But this has to be viewed on a backdrop of rising alarm about climate change, meaning that sustainable, low-carbon energy sources like wind and solar are going to play a big part in fuelling those industries. But, according to most industry insiders, that won't be enough. The intermittent nature of harnessing solar and wind energy and the relative lack of scalable storage options has instead led scientists to turn their attention to a maligned and subsequently sidelined alternative to make up the difference, and that is nuclear energy. Are policymakers warming to the idea of a nuclear glow? Well, many think so, and later on in this programme we'll look at the cutting edge of nuclear tech, including speaking with world-leading engineers at the forefront of the field with the UK firm Rolls-Royce, who are proposing fleets of much smaller off-the-peg reactors, they're dubbed SMRs or small modular reactors, which they say could be assembled much more rapidly and at considerably lower cost than their gargantuan predecessors. So what's the current state of play of the nuclear energy arena? Simon Taylor at the Cambridge Judge Business School is the author of The Fall and Rise of Nuclear Power in Britain, a History.
The UK is now making really quite good progress towards decarbonising its electricity system, which is the new government's goal by 2030. Not everyone thinks that will be achieved, but perhaps by 2035, the original target. And what that means is that now, at least on days when it's sunny and the wind's blowing, most of the electricity we consume is renewable. There's a small amount that is nuclear, but on days when it's very cold and dark and not very windy, we still rely on natural gas. That's the part which needs to be phased out over the next 5 or 10 years.
And the nuclear landscape over time, how has that changed in the last few decades?
Well, Britain was a pioneer in nuclear, and for a long time there was a lot of optimism that nuclear could become the main source of electricity in the UK. And those hopes essentially gradually became more and more frustrated as both the cost of nuclear and also the efficiency of the nuclear stations both disappointed. And by the 1980s, we had pretty much given up building nuclear, although we still had quite a lot of existing stations. And really, until the early 2000s, nuclear was seen as simply a legacy asset. We make the best of what we have, but we won't build any more. And that changed really around about 2006-07, when the government, facing both the gradual running out of North Sea oil and gas on the one hand, and also a desire to decarbonize the electricity system on the other, created really a new argument for building new nuclear. And since then, we've had one nuclear reactor project under construction at Hinkley Point C, and probably a second to start in the next year or so at Sizewell C in Suffolk.
How has the proportion of energy we get from nuclear changed? Because we're down now at single numbers of percent, I think, aren't we? But we were much higher in the past.
Yes, nuclear reached a little over 20% of total electricity generated at its peak, which would have been around about the late 1990s. And that was partly a reflection of the fact that it was only in the 90s that some of the early reactors that were built in the 60s and 70s reached their full potential in terms of running for a large proportion of the year. But since then, the reactors have been gradually closing. The really old reactors, the so-called Magnoxes, the first generation, are all closed. And quite a lot of the second generation, the advanced gas-cooled reactors, have also closed. There are some still operating, and they've already had their lives extended in some cases more than once. That may go on a little bit longer, but by 2030, we are unlikely to have any reactors operating other than the reactor at Sizewell B, which is the one that was the last new reactor to be built.
But those new reactors have been dogged by overruns and cost inflations year after year, to the point where we're talking about hundreds of % over original starting estimates and nearly a decade late and so on. So why is there now an appetite to do more of this?
Yes, nuclear in Europe and the US, but not in Asia, has a really terrible track record in the last 10 or 15 years of overruns, which, as you say, extend to many years. And I think the main reason for that is that in Europe and in the US, we stopped building reactors and we're having to relearn how to build them. And it's turning out to be a very painful experience. I think the hope is that the costs will come down further, or we will switch to a new version of nuclear, the so-called small modular reactors, which have the potential, at least, of much lower costs. And what nuclear has in its favor, particularly for a country like the UK, is that it generates a lot of reliable, continuous, low-carbon energy in a very small area compared with, for example, wind farms or solar, which take up a lot of space. So in the UK context, that is potentially very attractive.
As an economist, you'll know all about economics of scale. And the idea, or the argument was, if we build a really big nuclear power station, we'll get a huge economy of scale because it will serve a big population. Now the message coming through is that's inefficient. We need to build lots of little nuclear power stations because then we can get economies of scale, albeit in production. Why this switch around?
Well, the key word is production. You're right that it wasn't just nuclear, but even coal stations, which were the backbone of British electricity generation for really most of the last 100 years. Scale was seen as a good thing. There are certain fixed costs of building a power station in terms of grid connections and security and water supplies and so on. And there was some merit in the argument that bigger is better. The argument for small modular reactors is that we observe in manufacturing, whether it's making cars or iPhones or whatever, that people, when they do something on a large scale, large volume, they get very good at doing it. They learn by experience. And that learning by experience, that falling unit cost, is something that we have not observed in the nuclear industry. And we've seen it to a very limited extent in Asia, but not in Europe or the US. So the idea is, if you can design a new type of reactor, which is in effect built in a factory in a very controlled environment and which benefits from that learning by doing that we observe in other areas of manufacturing, it should be possible to get the unit cost down considerably as long as you build a lot of them.
And what's that magic number of lot? 10, 20, 50?
That's a very good question. I think you struggle to find anyone wishing to own up to that. It's probably nearer 10 or 20 than it is, say, 5 or 6. But the problem is that because these reactors have not yet been built, any forecasts about the magic point where the costs fall rapidly is something of it's a forecast, it's a conjecture. And while the argument's a very plausible one in principle, it does have a slight chicken-egg conundrum, which is that somebody has to provide the financing to buy the first few reactors and indeed to pay for the factory that builds them, knowing that they will almost certainly be the most expensive units. And it's only later on that the costs come down. And that somebody probably has to be the government. Although we do see some of the big technology companies in the US signing contracts now for small modular reactors, which will help to provide the kind of early investment needed to get to the scale at which point costs should in principle come down.
And what do the critics say?
Well, the critics say at one level, well, this is all fine and it's a perfectly good argument, but we actually have no evidence yet. I mean, Rolls-Royce, which is a company I greatly respect and admire, has a wonderful sales video for their small modular reactor. And it's a wonderful video and it shows you this very nicely designed reactor. And at the end of it, you sort of have to remind yourself, there is no such reactor in existence yet. It doesn't actually exist other than as a computer simulation. And that's not a criticism in itself, but it means that we ought to be a little bit careful about any assumptions we make until we actually start seeing these things built and see how it works out in practice. I'm not negative about them, but I think critics have the right to say, well, show us some actual engineering data, show us some completed reactors, and let's see how much they actually cost.
And we will indeed hear from Rolls-Royce a bit later on in the programme. That was Simon Taylor from the University of Cambridge's Judge Business School. He's the author of The Fall and Rise of Nuclear Power in Britain a history. Well, now we're going to hear from Malcolm Grimston, who is a senior research fellow at the Centre for Energy Policy and Technology at Imperial College London. Malcolm's an expert on nuclear energy, and I began by asking him about Simon's comments on our country's current lack of functioning SMRs.
He's certainly quite right to note that we haven't got any running examples at the moment. On the other hand, there is an enormous amount of interest right the way across the nuclear world in small modular reactors at the moment. There is research projects going on in China, UK, clearly, US, elsewhere in Europe, and so on. Driven, I think, by a recognition that large-scale nuclear still very much has a part to play when you've got a big grid with central point sources of generation, then 1,500 megawatts or whatever the size of a big nuclear reactor is still makes a great deal of sense. But there are also circumstances in which you're going to want smaller, more flexible units. Countries whose grids are not as developed as yet, for example, and reactors that are a little bit more able to follow load, to switch on and off. With a big reactor, you can load follow with it, but it's not very economically attractive. With smaller reactors, if you've got a station made up of 5 or 10 separate units, then at times of low demand over the summer in the Northern Hemisphere, you can switch them off, and so the economics are improved in that sort of way.
Do you think people will switch them off, or will they say, well, this is a bit of a cash cow, it's quite cheap to run, it's got no carbon footprint, I'm just going to run it flat out all the time and make as much money as I can?
It very much depends on what else is going on in your electricity system. If you have a system which is based on dispatchable capacity, so you can switch it on and off as you need it, and we're really talking in the modern world about gas, although in many countries coal continues to play that role, then in those circumstances, yes, the fact that nuclear power stations are relatively expensive to build and relatively cheap to run compared to fossil fuels, then you would run them all the time. The interesting question, of course, is in those countries which are increasingly dependent on variable renewables, where the demand, as we've seen in the last few weeks in Europe, for example, can vary enormously. In those circumstances, you need something that can ratchet its output up and down, depending on what's coming out of the renewables at any particular time.
Because some people say, well, look, we know how much nuclear costs and we know how much we're going to have to invest in a technology we don't have yet. Batteries are here and they're here now, and they're getting cheaper all the time, and they're getting better all the time. Why don't we spend the money on a battery instead, some are saying? How would you answer that?
I mean, bearing in mind that with batteries, you've got two issues. There's the output of the battery. So you need to be able to match megawatt for megawatt, gigawatt for gigawatt, whatever it is that you are trying to replace at any moment. But there's also the capacity. If you have a period of 2 or 3 weeks without wind, which we see on a number of occasions in Europe, it's no good having several gigawatts of battery capacity if they've all run flat. You can get somewhere with batteries. The world is nowhere close to battery technology yet. 99% of storage is still done with pumped hydro storage in the world. So there's no single silver bullet with this. We're going to see a lot of things working together. But I think imagining that batteries are anywhere close to answering the sort of questions of the intermittency of renewables at the moment is, I think, simply not the case.
What then is the vision for how we would deploy the next generation of nuclear in the UK?
It may well be a mixture. We have, of course, Hinkley Point C being built at the moment, and the likelihood of other stations. That's 3.3 gigawatts. It's big. On its own, it will generate about 7% of UK electricity. And so replacing the large plants that have started to come off to the end of their lives recently and will be pretty much gone by the early 2030s, that's a mega thing. In terms of smaller modular reactors, you can put them closer to cities, probably on safety grounds. That means that your distribution network doesn't have to be as big. There'll be a number of industrial processes. It's interesting that the IT industry, those are very, very large point demands of electricity, where an SMR would be pretty much ideal on the assumption that they can be built to time and cost. And so some developing niche areas of very high demand. So initially, I think we'll see those sorts of developments. Beyond that, of course, they can end up just fitting into a grid like any other development. We call them SMRs as if these are something magical and new, but actually the Magnox plants in the UK, the first generation nuclear plants, the earlier ones of those, fit into the up to about 350 megawatt bracket that would have them defined as smaller reactors today. The other big point, of course, is that you move away from a system where you build nuclear reactors as a construction project and far more towards you assemble nuclear reactors as a manufacturing process. And this should allow much more economies of scale. The supply chain should settle down without having to make quite significant changes depending on the particular requirements of a reactor site.
The case sounds quite compelling, but there seems to be enormous inertia somewhere in the system. We know we've heard industry leaders, we'll hear from Rolls-Royce a bit later, who are saying or have said that they've got concepts, they want to see progress, and other countries appear to be going ahead. The UK appears to be sitting on its laurels a bit. What's the reason for that? What's dragging things back?
The idea of a merchant nuclear plant, of building a nuclear plant and then hoping that you've got a market at the end of it that's going to make a profit, is really pretty much a non-starter. You need to have very strong guarantees about something along the way, either managing the cost of the project, that risk being shared, or guaranteed markets into the future. And of course, only governments can make that sort of guarantee, because a market as a whole tends to be much more focused on the short term. So government's involvement is required, certainly at the research and development and deployment stage, probably on going into the market. And the UK has always been rather ambivalent about this. On the one hand, it says this is a competitive market, it's up to industry to decide. But on the other hand, it then intervenes in all sorts of ways in that market to push things in the right direction. It's the sort of thing that can often be difficult in a democracy, because the benefits of this will probably accrue to the government after, or maybe the government after the one that's actually taking the decision and putting the money up. And when that competition is with putting more money into the health service or benefits or whatever it happens to be, that's been a British disease in all infrastructure, that we kind of lost that great ability that the Victorians had of thinking long term and making investments in infrastructure, which would then pay off over decades to come. But if people hadn't been doing that for us back in the great days of the railways or the power stations that were built in the 60s and 70s, then we'd be in a much worse state. And we I think, kind of owe that to the future, that we provide for them in the way that previous generations have provided for us.
Malcolm Grimston at Imperial College London there.
The Naked Scientists podcast is produced in association with Spitfire, cost-effective voice, internet and IP engineering services for UK businesses. Find out how Spitfire can empower your company at spitfire.co.uk.
Music in the programme is sponsored by Epidemic Sound. Perfect music for audio and video productions.
You're listening to the Naked Scientists podcast with me, Chris Smith, and this week we're looking at the next generation of nuclear power. So what is being done practically in the nuclear space? The UK blue chip Rolls-Royce has been responsible for designing nuclear propulsion systems for the Royal Navy submarines for the best part of 70 years now, and they're actually hoping to use some of that expertise to help to kickstart a nuclear renaissance in civil nuclear in the UK. Lee Warren's the Director of Engineering and Technology at Rolls-Royce Submarines. What, I wanted to know first, are the advantages that nuclear energy offers, though, for undersea operations?
The great thing about nuclear energy from a propulsion perspective is it doesn't need air, it doesn't need to breathe, in real simple terms. So what we're able to do, and have been able to do since the late 50s, is harness the power of nuclear fission in a relatively small package, put it in a submarine, and what that actually ends up with is a fighting vessel that is only limited by its ability to feed the crew. That is the limiting factor for how long a submarine can stay submerged and go on patrol to do all the things that the government needs it to do.
Presumably, though, enormous amounts of learning have emerged from this in terms of how you do this on the small scale and how you can scale that up potentially, because one of the concepts about Rolls-Royce modular reactors, for example, is you want to now produce things which are a fleet of these sorts of small shrunk down condensed reactors that could power towns?
The detailed technology that we use for submarine propulsion for our government is, as I'm sure your listeners will understand, highly classified because it provides a military advantage to our government. Having said that, the broader know-how and how you can harness the power of fission in a nuclear reactor can absolutely be scaled. It is scaled currently in terms of gigawatt power stations that provide power to our electric grid in the UK today. As you mentioned in your question, it's also being scaled from a Rolls-Royce SMR perspective, small modular reactor perspective. We're also downscaling this technology from a micro reactor application too. So it has lots of really exciting applications of all scales.
What about pairs of hands, though, Lee? Because one of the things that keeps on emerging from the manufacturing sector is people say we need skilled people who can do this. Now, in order to scale up this sort of thing, to do the kinds of projects we've been discussing, powering towns with small modular reactors or even sending them into space, you need the kinds of people who can do this. Can you lay your hands on the skilled hands that you're going to need?
Great question. So the previous government last year launched something called the Nuclear Skills Task Force. Rolls-Royce were heavily involved in that. I was personally a member of that group. The great thing about it was we all came together, and when I say we, I mean all of the major organisations that comprise the UK nuclear industry. We did a forward look on the amount of work that is ahead of us. So that is power generation, submarine propulsion today, submarine propulsion tomorrow, even including fusion as well as fission. And we took that forward load and came up with a number of recommendations into government for what we needed to do differently to make sure that we have the skills that we need to meet all of our commitments today and tomorrow, and actually out to about 100 years from now. It was far more than a wish list. It came with some committed funding, and some of that has been recommitted by the current government as well.
So they're dead serious about this, aren't they?
Very much so. And speaking from a Rolls-Royce specific perspective, we saw this coming. We opened a dedicated Nuclear Skills Academy explicitly to generate the capabilities that we need for the future.
Lee Warren with Rolls-Royce Submarines. But can we go even further and even smaller with this concept? Possibly even into space. As plans move ahead for bases on the moon and even mining and forging operations in orbit to take advantage of microgravity conditions, energy is going to be the limiting factor. So why not make a mini nuke? Well, Rolls-Royce are also working on those too, with a lineup of reactors that are even smaller than their smallest modular reactors. They're appropriately called micro-reactors, and to explain how they work, here's Katie Jarman, Assistant Chief Engineer at Space, Rolls-Royce Novel Nuclear.
A microreactor is a pretty general term for any sort of small-scale nuclear, and they vary in size and they vary in power depending on what the application is. So our Rolls-Royce microreactors go from about 40 kilowatts from a space perspective, powering moon bases for humans to live there, to, at the upper limit, about 20 megawatts, so enough to power a small town, but transportable by lorry or shipping container.
Really? So you could have something capable of powering a town that would fit in a shipping container?
That's the plan.
How much would something like that weigh?
So we're talking about probably under 10 tons. Obviously, to launch a microreactor and then land it on the moon and make it easily transportable around the moon, as light as possible is the answer. So every gram, every kilogram that you're putting on that rocket makes it more expensive, makes it more difficult. Getting it under 7 or 8 tons would be a really good thing.
Can you tell me what's inside the box, as it were? So when we've got this shipping container-sized thing, this is a self-contained micro-reactor, what's actually going on in there? How does it work?
It works very similarly to big, large-scale nuclear power plants. So ultimately, it's generating heat through nuclear fission, transporting that heat to a turbine or another way of generating electricity. The microreactors specifically have a choice of different technologies, and the main decision that you're making is how you're transferring that heat from the nuclear core, from the uranium atoms, into your gas turbine to generate the electricity. Some use molten salt, some use liquid metal. Heat pipes have been a really compelling technology to be able to do that. We've chosen to use gas because it enables us to leverage our nuclear experience as well as our industrial heritage in gas turbines for aeroplanes to make it as small, as compact as possible.
Is the idea that these are, to take a battery analogy, the equivalent of a rechargeable battery where you could go in and replace the fuel in them to give them a longer life?
It depends, and it will vary from design to design, depending on how big it is, what its actual application is, how easy it is to get to wherever you're positioning it. There's benefits in both ways. One of the main big things around microreactors is that the whole thing is pretty compact and is designed to be pretty self-sufficient and flexible. So it might be easier to just replace the whole thing.
It sounds amazing, this is a technology, because you could see if you've got a big building or a big site or something, you could just put one of these in and you wouldn't have to worry about having massive connections to the grid or whatever. You'd have a self-contained, reliable power supply at the place you needed it.
Absolutely. And I don't think anyone's saying that this is going to replace large-scale nuclear, but nuclear has obviously got a really important role to play in combating the climate emergency. Small nuclear also has a really important role to play exactly for that reason, because it doesn't need grid connection. You've got it exactly where you need it. So it's really useful to decarbonize the traditionally hard to decarbonize industries, whether it's hydrogen production, whether it's data centers. I mean, if you look at Ireland, I think about 20% of their national electricity consumption was data centers, and that puts an enormous strain on the infrastructure. And it also means that the data center companies are really sensitive to the price of electricity. Now, if instead of being reliant on the grid, they had their own entirely predictable, very reliable source of energy from a microreactor, for example, that is a complete game changer.
And I suppose by investing in doing this in space, if you can do it in space, you can do it anywhere. It will help to drive the implementation of this technology on Earth as well as up there on the moon base or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think they've shown, going way back to the Apollo missions, that one of the main benefits of doing those missions was all of the technology that it really kicked off back on Earth. Things like microprocessors came out of the Apollo missions. Something like a microreactor could be the Artemis generation's opportunity for really benefiting our lives here on Earth. This isn't sci-fi. This is what we're working on here and now. The Artemis missions go out to the early 2030s, and the intent is that fission power on the moon will be part of those.
And just to finish, Katie, because obviously when we talk about nuclear, people are always concerned about safety. And if we're into the realms where we're going to put these things into space, there's therefore a burden of proof that this is going to be safe on the part of the manufacturers and those using these sorts of devices. So how will you approach that? How are you going to safeguard this?
That's a really good question. So we all know that space launches are fraught with risk. One of the things that we are doing is making sure that the reactor has never gone critical and is not radioactive on launch. So it won't be turned on until it's in situ on the moon. Other things that we'll do is demonstrating that it's impact resistant. There are examples where they've put trains into transport containers to demonstrate that even under such a significant impact, they aren't scratched, they're not damaged in any way. And we'll be building up the confidence that we've got in its safety under those extreme circumstances throughout the design program and into manufacturing and test.
Katie Jarman at Rolls-Royce. That was absolutely fascinating, that insight into how technology is being used to harness power on Earth and out in space. So have our guests changed your mind, either for or against the idea of a nuclear renaissance? It strikes me that we have a terrific opportunity before us to become a world leader again, and as Malcolm Grimston put it, do for our next generation what the Victorian engineers did for us, and invest in our future. But will the government go for it? Time will tell. And talking of which, next time, James Titko is going to be here examining obsessive-compulsive disorder. What exactly is this, and can we treat it? The Naked Scientist comes to you from the University of Cambridge's Institute of Continuing Education. It is supported by Rolls-Royce. I'm Chris Smith, and from all of us here on the team, thanks for listening, and until next time, goodbye.